Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the historical context of the Corn Laws. And as I mentioned earlier, the Corn Laws were essentially a high tariff on imports of corn or agricultural produce from France to England. And again, those tariffs were a retaliation of England against France for the Napoleonic Wars. And they lasted from 1803 to 1814. So then after those wars, the tariff was imposed, and the question is, who did they favor? And at the time, at the early 19th century, there was like two classes in England. The one was the old class of the landed aristocracy, the landlords, but at the same time a new class was emerging, and that was the class of the industrialists, those who propelled the Industrial Revolution. So, but obviously the Corn Laws favored the landed aristocracy. So why? Because if there is a high tariff on imports from France, not a lot of produce will enter the English market from France, and more is being produced domestically in England, and that of course favors the landlords in England. So the Corn Laws made the landlords rich, and they forced the industrialists to pay a high real price for wages, and basically leaving less money for investment. So at the time, of the Corn Laws, industrialists, they paid something which is known as the subsistence wage. So let me write that here, the subsistence wage. So the subsistence wage was essentially the money value of a basket of goods. So think of it as a basket that each worker received. The subsistence wage consists of things like flour, maybe milk, butter, maybe eggs, bread. So basic commodities. That was part of the subsistence wage basket. So each worker received enough money to buy what the workers needed to feed themselves and their families, and it was just enough to stay on the subsistence level. That's why it's called a subsistence wage. But it was not enough to actually prosper. So now the idea of David Ricardo was that the Corn Laws, if he could repeal the Corn Laws, the price for that basket, so the price would go down. And of course it will not make a difference for the workers, because they will now get less dollars or pound sterling in England if let's say, so okay, assume that England gets rid of the Corn Laws, then more goods from France will enter the British market and will lower the price for flour, milk, butter, eggs and bread. So now that means that an industrialist has to pay a lower price for the same flour, milk and butter, eggs that ultimately the worker needs in order to feed their family and to stay alive, and leaving at the same time more money for investment. So that was the idea. And of course, repealing the Corn Laws was not really something that the landed aristocracy was particularly enthusiastic about, because they realized that this will take away profits from them and basically increase the profits of that new class of the industrialists. But even though David Ricardo was possessing lots of land too, because he was very rich, he realized that the future of England is not making the landed aristocracy ever richer, but to make sure that the Industrial Revolution will gain even stronger momentum. And David Ricardo realized that the Corn Laws were just like a break on industrial development of England. And that is, and he wanted to get rid of that. So, but what David Ricardo ultimately needed was a very powerful argument in order to convince the parliamentarians. England at the time was already a monarchy with a parliament, and David Ricardo needed to convince basically the parliament to change the law, but for that he needed a good theory, and that theory ultimately became the theory of comparative advantage. But that was the historical context. So England needed a theory to show that getting rid of the Corn Laws, which were favoring the landed aristocracy in England, that this is ultimately to the advantage of England. And so that was one aspect of the Corn Laws, and there was another one, which was the existing level of poverty at the time in England. And there was something else, which was a policy dispute about how shall we actually respond to that increase in poverty at the time. But for that to discuss, we first need to introduce another important figure of the time, which is Thomas Robert Malthus, but I will do that in the next video, and see you there.